Professor Nikk Effingham, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Philosophers have some kind of weird obsession with what they call the furniture of the world, the question of what exists at the most fundamental level. So why is that? Is that first an important question? And if so, why is it?
Is it an important question? Now, that is a difficult question to ask. Certainly, it is a question. I think it's a very interesting question because the question of what exists just sounds like the kind of thing that we should be interested in. It sounds like the kind of thing that philosophers should be doing. And it's the kind of thing that, if you're just wandering around the world, you might be interested in. You might be interested in what exists. Do tables exist? Do chairs exist? Do numbers? Do holes? Of course, that probably makes you a bit of a philosopher if you start asking questions like that. Is it important? Well, it depends what you mean by importance. Importance is to do with value and what you value. And I'm a very liberal guy. I'm not here to tell you what you should value. So I'm not really here to tell you what you personally should find important. I think that it's important. If you asked me, I would say it was important to those who want to know the answer. Is it important because it's going to make your microwave better or build a better airplane? This is not the case. This is not the case. It is highly unlikely that ontology would do that. It's highly unlikely that doing metaphysics of this style will do that. I think there's some people out there who would disagree with that, but that's probably not something I would go for.
Basically, you already need to have some kind of interest in philosophy, or you need to be the kind of person that already wonders about these things, based on your answer.
Yeah, that would be my view. I think if you do a bit of philosophy, every now and again, somebody will tell you that the answer to some other philosophical problem depends upon an answer to an ontological problem, a problem of metaphysics. Although if you ask Nikk Effingham, he'll actually say, I think that when you look into those things, you'll find that all sorts of ontological views will be compatible with whatever theory you give. My experience is even philosophical views that sound as if they depend upon certain answers to ontological views, my more experienced view, like speaking from my experience of philosophy, is that actually this is not the case. This is not the case, and all kinds of ontological theories can be compatible with all kinds of different philosophical views.
I'm interested in philosophy, so maybe it's hard to reason on why shouldn't that be an interesting question. But still, usually I try to do philosophy, but practically, in practice, to bring the ideas that I have and see, does that actually make sense in the world, not just abstractly. And I still believe that I'm forced to consider the question of what exists, because it's I need to understand the world and what is it composed of, so that I can try to think about what I should be doing in the world, or what should I trust in terms of epistemic reasons. What should convince me that I should care about, or that it exists, and so on. So do you think there's also this, if I want to set up a worldview and trying to understand how should I think, is that something that motivates the question of ontology?
I think that is, and I think what you've said is definitely true. As you approach the world and as you approach philosophical questions in general, having an ontological view to frame those questions is very, very helpful. And certainly I don't want to indicate that any ontological view is kind of as good as or as useful as any other ontological view. And I certainly don't want to indicate that they're all equally on a par. It's just that maybe discerning exactly which one is correct is less valuable. But certainly you are correct. Having an ontological view is going to be important for whatever you do. So even if it turns out, say you're looking at the question of whether you exist, say we're doing some sort of Cartesian skepticism, and you say, I think I exist, I think I am the most fundamental of insights. And then Nikk Effingham comes along and says, look, I'm not saying that's false, but I do know a few ontological theories that say that you don't exist. And actually, even though you don't exist, you don't need to change issues with ethics. You don't need to change issues with politics. You should still go to the supermarket. You should still love your children. But by the way, at the end of the day, none of these things exist. And the reason why I'd say that is that any theory that says that these things don't exist will come with this mass of theoretical machinery, some sort of complicated theory that explains why it is the case that even though you don't exist, or even though the table doesn't exist, or even though numbers don't exist, you should still love your children and be ethical, even if you don't exist. You should still put your coffee on the table rather than just dropping it in midair, even though actually tables don't exist. And you should still do mathematics and obey what a calculator tells you to do, even though there's no numbers. Because any serious ontological theory, even if it denies the existence of the thing, will have a lot of theoretical machinery to try and make sense of that, to try.
Okay. And so when you start wondering about these things, where do you start? Do you start by counting the stuff that is around you? Do you like, oh, there is a camera in front of me. There is Nikk Effingham.
That's a bad way to go. That's a bad way to go. So when we ask what exists, we're asking at a very general level. So lots of academics asking what exists. If I go and ask a biologist what exists, and they say, well, I spend my time finding new species of insects, they're trying to find out what exists, and that's clearly not what I'm doing. You know, that's not what I'm doing. When you discover that there's a new type of insect, I'm not like, oh, you've answered an ontological question there. Like, it just doesn't seem like that we're doing the same kinds of things. So philosophers asking, or at least metaphysicians in doing ontology, they're asking questions at a much more abstract level. So we're asking not whether the camera in front of me exists and the monitor in front of me exists and this cup of coffee exists. We're normally asking whether material objects in general exist. So we're asking, so the common sense view is that they do. Look, I mean, like, it's a cup of coffee. Who would deny that they exist? But maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe you believe what's called nihilism. Maybe you believe nihilism, mereological nihilism. You believe that there's only atoms. There's only atoms. So there's physical things in the world. There's lots of atoms here, and they're arranged in the shape of a coffee cup. But is there, in addition to them, extra to them, on top, is there actually a coffee cup? Well, now it sounds like we're asking a philosophical question, not the kind of question that a physicist would ask. The physicist knows the atoms are there. The physicist knows they're arranged coffee cup-wise. The question is there this extra thing, the coffee cup? And somebody, you know, already I can hear viewers going, well, that just is what a coffee cup is. You know, it just is some atoms arranged coffee-wise. I'm like, that's great. Like, that's a philosophical position. You know, you're not saying something that philosophers don't say. You're now embarking on, you've endorsed a philosophical position, a really contentious one. You've endorsed a really contentious philosophical position there, but it's something that somebody believes. And there's a range of other positions. Maybe nothing exists. That's a very weird view called ontological nihilism. Maybe George Berkeley is correct, and ideas exist, but material objects are just ideas, and in some very real sense, there's no coffee cup. There's just ideas stuck together. Like, there's loads of different views, and there's loads of different views. But we're asking at a very abstract level. So that doesn't quite answer your question. That tells you why we don't start. That tells you why we don't start by just picking out items from the universe and being like, oh, look, you know, a coffee cup exists. Coffee cup lid exists. To answer the questions, you generally speaking, this is how I do and how many philosophers do it. You identify what your default, sometimes what are called the folk intuitions. What does the average everyday person believe? You figure out what they are, and then you only shift from that if you have a good reason. Like, the average everyday person believes in a coffee cup, so I should only make you disbelieve in a coffee cup if I can give you a good reason to believe mereological nihilism, to believe ontological idealism, a good reason to believe that George Berkeley is correct and there's only ideas. So it's just about that enterprise of embarking on the mission of looking at arguments for counterintuitive things.
And that makes me think that when philosophers start by this folk knowledge and say, okay, let's see what happens, there is different entry points. And I think one of the first to think about what exists was Parmenides, ancient Greek philosopher. And he took it as at the most abstract level, I think, that we can think is simply either something exists or it doesn't exist, or what is and what is not. And then he concluded that therefore everything must exist. So there's only one thing. The rest, what we have, our experience, is an illusion. But there's just one thing, which is being. And that's just this huge sphere of being thing. That's it. So I think it's interesting to start there because that's one of the first that put this idea in place. But as you were saying, he started from kind of a common point of view. If I ask you what exists, you say everything. And many people would say everything that exists, and what doesn't exist. It feels very, very intuitive, and yet in the end, it has a huge impact, this idea, but we don't believe that anymore. Now, when you start by thinking about what exists, maybe you think already about a material object. So you already start with a plurality of things and not just like this one thing. So how come are there these different entry points, and how do we know which one to select?
Well, how come are the different entry points? Because people attack things in different ways. They come from different traditions and they start thinking about it differently. How do you choose which one to select? There's no reason to choose between them. There's no reason to choose between them. If ultimately we think that what's going on is looking for arguments that establish radical conclusions about ontology. Here's my argument for why chairs don't exist. Here's my argument for why numbers don't exist. Here's my argument for why numbers do exist. Here's my argument for why there's an infinite number of disconnected space-times where every possibility plays out. Each of those will be its own argument, and each of them can be evaluated in their own lights. Mm-hmm. And you just have to go through each argument step by step and break it down that way. That's my view. I worry about trying to do it some other way. I worry about thinking that there's like different traditions and narrows into the answers in different ways. Unless you're a relativist about knowledge, which I'm not, I think, there's just the facts that are true. There's just what's true. And we're trying to figure out what's true as opposed to what's false. Then every sound argument, that is every good argument, is going to lead us in the same direction to that set of truths. So any argument you give me in ontology will be worth following up, either to discover why it's sound or discover where it goes wrong, and maybe that'll help us inform us where other arguments go wrong.
And a common view right now, if that convinces a lot of people, is naturalism. So what exists is simply what our scientific theories are saying. And in this case, you were talking about mereological nihilism.
Nihilism, yeah.
This is a tricky word, but anyway, and this is something. It's simply to say that nothing, the tables and so on, don't exist. The only thing that exists is the particle at the most fundamental level. That's something that actually sounds crazy when you try to explain it, but that's what most people believe because that's what they infer from the scientific theories. In the end, we have the atoms, they're composed, they're put together, and then poof, we have material object, we have consciousness, we have everything. Is that a satisfying? What's the problem with this?
I mean, well, the big question there is we may settle on the idea that metaphysics is some kind of handmaiden to science. We may settle on the idea that we have to be beholden to what the science says, but there's going to be big questions about what that means. So, for instance, does science say mereological nihilism is true? Does science say that there's only atoms arranged cup-wise where my cup is? I mean, I'm not sure it does. It definitely says that there's atoms. Let's assume it definitely says that there's atoms. Everything gets to be up for debate, and that is something that's up for debate. But let's assume it said that there were atoms. It doesn't necessarily say that there's no coffee cup. So mereological nihilism would still not necessarily be true. Or here's another way of looking at it. Imagine you led off physics that mereological nihilism was true and all there are the tiny little atoms, or maybe a more sophisticated view, all it is like a quantum field with different quantum properties. Imagine you had that position, and then I go, well, you're not really obeying what science says, because I went and spoke to the biologists, and they told me that there exist all these insects, and they told me that there exist all of these people and all of these animals, and suddenly we've got this question. We've got this area of science says these things exist, and this interpretation of physics says that there's only atoms. I'm like, well, now we've got a conflict. So even if we're reading that off the physics, there'd still be a conflict. And when we look at other broader questions, do numbers exist? We can look at physics, we can look at biology. It's not clear to me. I mean, some people will say otherwise, but they'll say the argument is quite sophisticated. It's not obvious that that's going to inform whether numbers exist. It's not obvious that that's going to inform whether events exist. because, my challenge would be if someone thought it was true, I would say, well, run me through it. And I also think if we canvassed lots of people, if I canvassed a load of physicists, do you think numbers exist? We would find that they would differ over that view. In a way that if I surveyed a load of physicists and said, does Pluto exist? That'd be 100% yes. Like, they agree on certain ontological facts. Pluto exists. Do they agree whether numbers exist? I don't think they do. I don't. They're just not thinking about that kind of.
So I find it surprising that people can say, for example, Pluto exists, and at the same time, planet exists, or maybe I don't know, like, let's put numbers on the planet, and like the fourth planet of the solar system exists, and this one would refer to Pluto, for example. That means, in a way, we already have different interpretation of what exists means. Because does Pluto exist and the third planet of the solar system exists? Is there a simple term? What do we mean by existence? And is there a different type of existence?
I mean, that is going to be one of the deepest questions you can ask an ontologist is, what exactly do you mean by exist? And it's very, when I say it's very difficult to answer, that makes it sound like there's this answer that it's difficult to explain to you. I don't think that's true, that there's an agreed upon answer. Mm-hmm. What do we mean by exist? I mean, that's a good question. So some people will say, well, it's, we just mean exist. It's difficult to pin down a definition of this concept that's satisfactory because it's just so primitive. It's just so conceptually basic. Existence is the kind of thing that I do, and that Santa Claus does not do. Santa Claus does not exist, I exist. Even that will run into problems because there's some ontologists who think Santa Claus does exist. But let's set them aside for the time being. So you will get some people who have that view. Then there are people who actually think there's a multitude of different definitions to existence. So they get called ontological pluralists. They think there's many different types of existence. And that when you say that numbers exist, you mean that they exist in a very different way than you do if you say Nikk Effingham exists. Then there's people who think what are called permissivists. They think it's just obvious that this isn't quite an answer to your question, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's kind of relevant. They think it's obvious what exists. They think everything exists that you can think of. Santa Claus exists, I exist, numbers exist. Why do they exist? Because, there's say I said something like there's a fictional character called Santa Claus, isn't there? And you said yes. There's a fictional character called Santa Claus. I'd go, well, you said there is a fictional character called, so I guess he exists. And then they say that now the answer as to what exists is dead straightforward. They haven't really told us what we mean by existence by doing that, but at least we're getting some idea of what they mean by existence. But they do point out that things exist in different ways. I exist, Santa Claus exists, but he gets to be a fictional being who isn't in time and space, and I get to be a non-fictional being who is in time and space. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult. It's difficult, and it is these. I often meet students who turn around and go, oh, Nick, you've made me spend my introductory lecture thinking about whether holes exist. What do you mean by exist? And that's an awkward question for me because I'm like, oh, can we ask that in like week 10? When we can do all these very complicated theories that might have some relevance to what you've asked. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to answer that question.
Usually there is one way to categorize what exists. And this is, philosophers tend to say that there are properties in the world and that there are objects, and they have some different kinds of objects. What are those main kind of categories, or would you call them?
These are categories that stem. I mean, if there's a historian of philosophy here, they might be going epileptic if I said this. I believe they stem from the ancient Greek period, then they run through the medieval period, and they run until the modern day, into the 1950s. That's the difference between the universal and the particular. So the particular would be a particular thing, like myself, whereas a universal is something that can be found in universal places, multiply instantiated. And properties are a good example of that. So my black can be found here, but the top of my coffee cup is also black, so it can be found here. It can be found in two places. It's a universal. Mm-hmm. Is this a way that philosophers divide up the world? It is, and some take that division very, very seriously. They think that the whole of metaphysics is to be guided by this distinction between universals and particulars, and asking, are there any universals? Is everything a particular? This was a big thing in medieval metaphysics. This has been a big thing in metaphysics for a while. Is that the only way that people see it? No, not everyone sees it. Some people are a bit like, I'm less worried about the universal particular distinction. But that's the distinction. That's the distinction.
And so basically, when they look at this, trying to create the broadest categories, some of those philosophers said, well, there are things that I see in the world, they are there, and they're basically defined as having a place in space-time, right? I'm here at this moment, so yeah. I'm an object. That's one of the definitions for the object. And then there are those weird things that are, let's talk about redness. Redness doesn't seem to be in a specific space, in time and in space.
Yeah, or fictional characters like Santa Claus or the numbers.
Exactly.
All these things up there in Platonic heaven, they're not in time and space.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's the issue? Do you think this problem, the one over many problem by Plato, that the objects must be in place in a certain, there's only one of them. There is Kevin here because I'm there at this moment, so we know there is this guy. But the blackness of my t-shirt and yours is in different spot at the same time. Is that a problem? Do you think? Do you still see that as an issue that must convince us about finding a solution for that?
Some people do. A famous philosopher called David Armstrong made the one over many in his particular interpretation of that argument, like the linchpin of his ontology. I actually think it's a bit of a misnomer, and it's not. Everyone calls it the one over many problem. It's a bit of a misnomer to call it a problem. It's an argument. It's an argument for the existence of universals or the existence of insert ontological answer here. You begin with this worry. What is it that makes my black t-shirt and your black t-shirt similar? They say, says the Platonist, there must be this property of blackness that they both share. And then other philosophers go, no. They get to be similar without there having to exist, without there having to be this property. What might make them similar? Maybe they're just similar. Maybe it's just a brute fact. This object here and that object where you are, they're just similar. They just resemble one another. Why do we need these extra properties? And then they get into this big debate. And that is definitely a big debate even until today. And you've got the one side, the realists who say that the properties do exist. And then the other side, the nominalists who say that we can account for these similarities between these objects. And you don't need any properties. You can ignore the properties. You can account for it in some other way.
So the challenge that is solved in the beginning was this resemblance. You said it, but maybe I want to give it a defense. So usually, what they would answer people that believe that there is a problem there and that we need to find a solution to that, and don't accept the resemblance, mean that if there is a resemblance between two things, it must be because of something in the world that makes it resemble the other one, right? So that means, for example, like your redness or like the blackness of your t-shirt, it has some kind of connection. You said it's a brute fact, but for a brute fact, I mean, if it's a brute fact, it seems that it cannot be explained, but we must know that there is a connection between it.
Well, it can't be. So here it gets quite interesting. So we've just used the word explained. And when you use the word explained, we need to recognize that there's many different types of explanation. So, for instance, imagine you come around to my house and my windows are dirty and you can't see through them. And you say, can you explain to me, Nick, why it's so dark in here? You know, why are the windows dirty? I might give you a scientific explanation of one hand. I might give you an explanation that says, well, because the particles of dirt are on the window, they obscure the absorption of the photons. So it's dark in here. That's why the windows are dirty. I might give you a historical explanation. I might say, well, look, you know, the dirt from outside is settled on the window and I haven't washed them. Or I might give you an emotional explanation. I might say, look, I've been very depressed. And so I haven't done the housework. And all these three things would be an explanation of what you're asking. Obviously, depending on the context, tells me which explanation you're looking for. But they all explain the same thing. Why is that important here? Well, we've got this question. What is it that explains that my t-shirt being black and your t-shirt being black is similar? What explains the similarity of our t-shirts? And it sounds quite easy to say. It sounds quite intuitive. It sounds quite seductive to say, well, there's got to be some kind of explanation. And of course there is, but we might think the explanation for that is purely scientific. The atoms arranged t-shirt wise where I am form a certain reflection pattern that absorbs certain light, and that's very similar to the atoms arranged where you are. And that scientific explanation would clearly explain why, in that sense, our t-shirts are similar. But if we're doing ontology, they were never the explanations we were interested in. We were interested in the metaphysical explanations. So why is my t-shirt black in a metaphysical? What explains it in this metaphysical sense? Or if you like, let's shift away from our t-shirts. Let's shift to electrons. Imagine, I don't necessarily think this is true, but it'll do for example. Imagine the electron is a fundamental particle. And I go, well, this electron here is charged and this electron here is charged. What explains that resemblance? So now there is no there's no scientific explanation because I've stipulated that, I have picked the item that is at the bottom of the scientific chain. There is no explanation of why this one and this one are the same. We're looking for a metaphysical explanation. And now suddenly it becomes a little bit more seductive for me to turn around and go, why has this fundamental particle got this property and this fundamental particle got this property? Why are they similar for someone to just go, I think they just are, I don't think there's any extra, no more explanation is needed. So you can kind of get sucked into thinking that there needs to be an explanation, but I do worry whether that's because you had in mind a different form of explanation than the kind of explanation that the person learning the one over many argument is going to be pushing. And that's not to say that no explanation is required. It's just to say, maybe it's not so obvious that one is required. I don't know. How does that sound?
Yes, it sounds good, but I feel it's really like a silver bullet for the critics of philosophy, because there's many philosophical questions that, when you start thinking about them, it becomes very dark and deep, and you're like in the weeds and you're wondering about details and like, oh, how can that happen? But at the same time, it contradicts with this and so on. Well, many people would say because that was not even a question in the beginning, like it just is.
It was a question. It was just that one of the answers is just to say it's a brute primitive fact. So let's imagine your imaginary interlocutor who's had it in for metaphysics. And they just go, well, if I'll just endorse that theory each time. What explains resemblance? Brute fact. What explains modality? That is, what explains possibility? Why is it possible that Nikk Effingham could be a fisherman? Why is it possible that this electron, which is here, why is it possible that it could have been here? And I guess an answer to that is just to say there is no explanation. Maybe that's just a brute fact. Imagine we do this for all of the different areas of philosophy. Why does 2 + 2 = 4? Maybe it just does. You could do that. That brutalist theory, the mega theory of brutalism. But it seems to me that when you do that, and I go, well, I've got some metaphysicians who have thought about this, and they've got this slicker, more cohesive theory that says, rather than saying that all of these things are brute, you say that something's always brute. And in any sense, well, I don't want to go, let's say that something's always going to be brute in a metaphysical theory. I happen to believe that's true. There's exceptions. Something's going to be brute, but once I've taken this thing as brute, I can now explain all the rest. I can explain modality in terms of resemblance. So maybe I take resemblance as brute, but now I'm explaining modality in terms of it. Maybe I'm taking resemblance as brute, but now I can explain why 2 + 2 = 4. Or mix it around. Maybe if you believe in universals, if you believe that universals exist, you can now explain resemblance, and you can explain modality, and you can explain numbers. When I come up with that theory, the imaginary interlocutor can, of course, just dig their heels and go, oh, I don't see what's wrong with my theory. They can do that. But, I've got this theory. It's got fewer posits. It seems to be theoretically unified. It seems to explain things. when I apply the kind of analogues of the methodology of science to metaphysical questions, it seems as if we're having a debate about which metaphysical theory is true, and now we're doing ontology. So someone who can, if you can suck someone into the questions, even if they start saying it's brute, it's too late for them. They've started doing metaphysics. They're just developing a metaphysical theory where it's all brute. Mm-hmm. And then I can go, well, now we've got your theory. Listen to my theory and then tell me which is better.
Yeah, I think it's a great point because I've been discussing, I was on a video about ontology and someone was commenting and he was a naturalist, so explaining everything by the most basic fundamental, like the atoms of the world are the only things that exist. And so we had a good discussion, surprisingly. YouTube can also bring, there are also people that are very open and interesting. And so in the discussion, basically, he was saying that there is no mind don't exist, and numbers don't exist, and objects don't exist, and everything can be explained simply by you put the atoms together and like things emerge. And I say, well, if that's the case for the mind, let's say, you still need to explain how it emerged. How can you put the matter of your brain together so that out of sudden we have this experience that comes in that seems very different than matter. And so he said, well, that doesn't bother me. Like there is the limit of knowledge. We will explain it at some point, but that's it. And it made me realize that basically really any theory can be accepted as long as you just bite bullets. Like if you accept that, that we don't know, like in the end, you're not justified to kind of argue for that because you don't know that you're going to know later. And so it's simply to say, well, I just hope that that's going to be the explanation. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, but maybe that you can also venture into other territories to see those other explanations. Maybe they concede less, because if you need to live in a world without colors, without mind, without numbers, like there is not a lot which is left. And this is something that seems it seems that those things exist in some way. Like it's hard to just refute them.
Well, that's an interesting discussion you've had with that person, because that seems to cross over into another issue in metaphysics, or what we call metaphysics. We like that term. Questions about metaphysics was he really disagreeing that these things exist? So think about the way you phrased it. He believes that there's these atoms, when you arrange it a certain way, the thing emerges. I'm like, well, if the thing emerges, then the thing exists. Like the question wasn't, was the thing fundamental? The question was does the thing exist? I don't think Nikk Effingham is fundamental. I'm made up of atoms. I definitely think I exist. So that's one set of people who say, look, there's serious questions to be had about what exists. It sounds like he thought metaphysics was solely concerned with another question, which is what things fundamentally exist. And you're going to find metaphysicians take different views on this. So there are some metaphysicians who think that the only question is what fundamentally exists. Then there's going to be some who say, oh, no, there's questions about what fundamentally exists and what exists. And the questions about existence are actually pretty easy to answer. Like, Nick exists, the coffee cup exists, numbers exist, Santa Claus exists. The question is, which of these things fundamentally exist? And then you'll get people like me who say there's questions about what fundamentally exists, questions about what exists. Both these questions are really difficult to answer. And then you'll get a fourth set who goes, there's questions about what exists, and these fundamental exist. I don't know what you mean. Don't know what it means to fundamentally exist. There's just, do you exist or do you not?
Mm-hmm.
So and this is one of the things ontologists can do, is they can, by being experienced with these debates, by being experienced with using the concepts and the tools of metaphysics, we can help elucidate debates like that you just had, and elucidate that maybe you're talking past one another, and maybe you need to pin down exactly what's at question. And that goes back to the earlier thing you said when you said, what does it mean to exist? What does that mean? And when that's a difficult question. What we've just talked about now is just one example of why it's so difficult. Because do you have in mind existence, or did you have in mind fundamental existence?
Well, in those 35 minutes, you convinced me that you think about questions that might be interesting. Now I'm curious. You talked about the tools of the metaphysician. So what do you have in your garage behind you? Do you have, what kind of tools do you use to dive in and try to make sense of things that we cannot really assess, measure just by instruments?
In some occasions, you get an argument. In some cases, you get an argument that is going to drive you towards a certain conclusion. More usually, it'll turn out that there's competing ways to solve that argument, and it's unclear which one to pick between. So what you end up doing is developing theories, and then you're looking at theories and you're trying to adjudicate which theory is true. Mm-hmm. The ways in which you adjudicate the theory, this is a term from a famous metaphysician called David Kellogg Lewis, probably the leading metaphysician, probably one of the leading philosophers, actually, of the late 20th century and into the 21st, and massively influential in philosophy. And most people on the street have never heard of David Lewis, whereas every philosopher has heard of David Lewis. And it's just one of those things that's going to take some time to trickle down. In 100 years, in the same way that people know the name Bertrand Russell, I imagine they'll know the name David Lewis. David Lewis says you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. You figure out the costs of the theory, and you figure out the benefits of the theory. And then we kind of pair it off. And there's no set-in-stone way of doing that. But that's life. That's life. Because you're doing these cost-benefit analyses with any theories. Say you're a physicist. You'll have your theory of the universe, and other people will have their theories. And they'll have costs and they'll have benefits, and we'll be pairing them off. You'll do this as a detective. You've got your theory of who did the time. I've got my theory who did the time. And there'll be costs and benefits. And sometimes it's dead easy. I'll be like, I think the person who did it was the man covered in blood who said, I'm glad I killed him. And I'm going, no, I think it was aliens. And I'm going, I think I'm like, sometimes it's easy to tell, but sometimes it's harder to tell. You know, that we know this in murder cases. Sometimes it can be hard to tell who did it. And you're adjudicating the costs and benefits. So it's quite normal for it to be the case that it's hard to tell what dimensions you're using to weigh them along. And it's hard to tell exactly what the costs and benefits are, but still nevertheless engage in the practice. So what kinds of costs and benefits are we looking at? We're looking at ontological parsimony. You're looking for a theory that stipulates the fewest things existing. This is a reason to stipulate fewer things. Do properties exist? Well, you know, it'd be better if they didn't, because then it'd be more parsimonious. If I could explain everything that goes on in the universe without never mentioning properties, well, isn't that better than a theory that just adds them in? There's something called ideological parsimony, which is how complicated is your theory, effectively. How many basic concepts where I go, I can't explain that concept. You're just gonna have to buy into that concept. How many basic concepts do you need to explain the world? And then there's going to be how well does it cohere with the data? Because we do have data. We have data we're trying to explain. You might think that data is just your folk beliefs. The data has to be that coffee cups exist. The data has to be that people get married, and so there's marriages. The data has to be that I've got a hole in my pocket, and therefore holes exist. Or you might, if you're more naturalistically inclined, say, no, the only data you need to explain is scientific data. So you don't need to explain Nikk Effingham's belief that there's a hole in his genes. You just need to explain the articles of Physical Review D, like this journal in physics. Only explain what's in there. And then there'll be a raft of in between. So you can have a load of data, and your theory is going to explain things, and sometimes your metaphysical theory will fail to explain everything. And I'll turn around and go, could you live with that? Could you not just buy into that for me? Could you not just live with that tiny little adjustment to what you believe? And that's how we'll do it. We'll figure out the complexity of the theory and how well it explains the data, how much data it explains, and then we'll weigh things up. And some of it will just depend on sheer believability, I guess. Some metaphysical theories can be bonkers, and some people are going to hold that against it.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about David Lewis, and he's known for bonkers ideas, that things that you're wondering. So just like, for example, the possible world, he believes that there are many different possible worlds at the same time that they really exist, and that have different possibilities for each of these worlds. And so I mean, it seems like a heavy price to pay. And yet one of the best metaphysicians of the world decides to say, well, I'm going to take this. Maybe he's alone in there, but he's ready to say, well, it explains more than it costs in the end.
Yeah. And he plays down the costs. It's bonkers. It's bonkers. Like, if it wasn't bonkers, more people would believe it, is my view. So I think we've got to say it's bonkers. But he plays down the costs. He says, look, you now believe in a lot of worlds, but like you just believe in more of the things you already believed in.
Mm-hmm.
So you believe in a physical universe, don't you? And I nod and go, yeah, I believe in a physical universe. I just believe in more of those things. I don't have to believe in numbers. I don't have to believe in properties. I don't have to believe in abstract objects. It doesn't entirely get rid of abstract objects, but you could imagine someone learning this line saying, look, the aim is to get away from abstract objects. He says, look, you only have to believe in the things that science and mathematicians talk about, sets and physical objects. Isn't that great, And then he also plays down the costs. When I go, that's really weird, David. You've told me that so you're saying there's a universe exactly like this one, except suddenly I stand up and start dancing and then run out of the room for no good reason. And he goes, yeah, that's possible. So there's a universe where that goes on. I go, that sounds really weird. I don't think those things exist. He believes in talking donkeys, And then what Lewis will do is go, that's a cost, but I'm not going to explain to you why you shouldn't worry about that cost. It's not actually a cost, because his move is to say, talking donkeys don't actually exist. They don't actually exist, he says. David Lewis doesn't believe they actually exist. To actually exist, to exist in the universe with me. There's no talking donkeys in a universe with me, so they don't actually exist. And then he says, but I do think they exist. And when you go, oh, so there's a difference between actual existence and existence, we're back again to this question. What did you mean by existence? What did you mean by existence? When David Lewis says there's a difference between actual existence and existence, he goes, you should see that actually you don't have any intuitions about what exists. You've got intuitions about what actually exists. So it's not counterintuitive to not believe in the donkeys. I still think it's bonkers. I disagree with David Lewis, but that's what he says. But that's a good example of that cost-benefit analysis in action, and another good example about how often we're going to come back to that same question. What did we mean by exist? What did you mean by exist?
So here we have basically theories that we compare them, and we compare them in the same way that when I come home and I see, I don't know, that there's a pot of coffee that is on the ground and broken, and let's say I have a dog and I see the dog there, I'm going to try to make an inference to the best explanation. I'm going to say, well, maybe it's the dog and it's not aliens that just came up and pushed that, or it's not God that decided to act and it's a miracle and now it's broken. The easiest way, the less costly explanation is the dog did it, right? Okay, and so now I'm going to go one step lower in the more abstract. So basically what happens before we have those theories, because for these theories to exist, we need to conceptualize them. And it seems that we put things together with language and reason, some kind of rules of reason. And when we talked before about the is, you talked about the is when I say, oh, what is, that's what I mean by existing. And I talked about Parmenides when he said there is what is and what is not. It seems that those words mean different things. And Wittgenstein said that maybe philosophy is just about those words. The problem is language is necessary for us to conceptualize things. And people might say, well, in the end, philosophers, they dive into those concepts, but those concepts are different than the world. It's just like you're talking about the dictionary or like the words that are composed language. What do you think?
I think it's an important challenge. And I don't think the metaphysician necessarily has to shy away from the idea that a lot of the questions we're doing are, in fact, linguistic questions. And that a lot of the time we are, in fact, doing philosophy of language. And that when someone turns around and says, look, it seems that you're caught up on a linguistic issue. Mm-hmm. This is a question about language. I'll often hear this from people who are, particularly when they're skeptical of metaphysics, this is just a question about language. And my answer is, well, maybe so. But why are questions about language not interesting? Go and ask a linguist whether questions about language are interesting. There can be lots of interesting questions about language. So even if it turns out even if it turns out that certain conversations we're having are going to be settled by issues solely, or at least partially, in the philosophy of language or in linguistics or in just understanding how language works, that's still a success. Because if you were interested in what the answer was, do wholes exist? Do numbers exist? Is the property black exist? Even if it turns out that the answer to that is to be sourced by solely looking at language, that's what you wanted, and that's what you've now got.
Mm-hmm.
Do I believe that it's purely linguistic? I don't think it is. I don't think the questions about existence are purely linguistic. I think there's a non-linguistic, like there's a sense of existence that is not merely dictated by how you and I happen to use the term.
Mm-hmm.
There's more to that term than use. The world has to contribute something to settle whether spiders exist or whether Santa Claus exists in such a way that it's not a purely linguistic question. So a good example would be an example of a purely linguistic question. Imagine you and I are arguing about the shape of footballs, and I'm arguing that they're round, and you're arguing that they're oblate, egg-shaped spheroids, and we go at it. We go at it for days. We write papers, academic papers on who's right. And somebody turns up and says, look, this is nonsense. Nick, you mean soccer ball. You mean American football.
Mm-hmm.
You're not are footballs round? This is not a question. You are having a verbal dispute. That would be a good example. Are we having the same dispute if you say, I think I exist, and I say, I think you don't? I think there's more to it than that. Not every metaphysician does. And I'm okay. And that's still metaphysics. We're still doing really interesting metaphysics, even when they argue that I'm wrong. We are now doing something that's substantially philosophy of language. That's just how it is. Don't be afraid of that.
Okay, yeah, I think it's a good answer for that, because it's a huge issue. And as I study philosophy, there is also this moments that I think come up with anybody interested in it, being like, it does that even. What's the point? Like, is it even a question or is it just like a? But the stimulation of the brain when you do it is also agreeable. So in the end, it's also fun to do.
I mean, imagine the answer was that it's not really a question, that there's something defective about it. Like David Chalmers, I'm sure many of you viewers will have heard of David Chalmers. He's got papers arguing that the very concept of existence is defective, and that we shouldn't be asking questions about what things exist. And that's really interesting. Don't think that you have to think that's definitely false before you do metaphysics. When you start thinking about that, when you start thinking about whether the question itself is defective, you are now doing metaphysics. Don't mistake yourself that you're not being pulled into it. Even if you say that the field is somehow intrinsically flawed, you're still being a metaphysician when you do that.
Mm-hmm. And even if you embrace like the most common view, and you said like, well, like everything is atoms. Well, it's a positive claim you're making.
Yeah.
Like now you're saying something about the world, and now you can be countered. No?
Yeah. If someone says, Nick, you just are your atoms. And I'm like, oh well, you made a metaphysical claim there. You're saying that identity, the relationship, that one thing can bear to another. Superman bears to Clark Kent. The President of the United States bears to Donald Trump. That relation can be held with many different things simultaneously. I'm like, I wouldn't have thought that was true. That's news to me. That I am many things. I am not one thing. I am many things. That sounds like a metaphysically weighty question, a metaphysically weighty claim to have made. If you think that's true, I think we've learned something about the world. I also think that you better defend it. Not you, but the imaginary interlocutor. If you're going to just offhand go, Nick, you are your atoms, of course you exist. It sounds like I've already got some reason to think that you're going to have to tell me something about your theory. Explain it.
So next time someone asks me, how are you? I'm going to answer, bold of you to assume that I'm something.
Yeah. We are. My plurality of atoms is doing great.
Exactly. How are we?
Yeah, how would you even phrase it? It's very difficult.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's talk about numbers, because you gave the example a few times. If you would need to try to explain a bit, like, what's the challenge is, usually numbers, we use it for a lot of things. It seems very accurate. It seems very good. And yet I never met Mr. and Miss 2 or number 3 and 7 and so on. Yet they seem to exist and we use them. But people say, see, they don't exist.
So that's a challenge. So you got the two sides. You got the realist side who says, look, if numbers don't exist, why did 2 and 3 make 5? Isn't that most obviously just to say that there's this thing 2, there's this thing, the number 3. They stand in this relation of addition to the number 5. Seems like that's what we're saying. If that's not true, what are the mathematicians talking about? Then on the other side, you've got the nominalist who says there are no numbers, and yeah, they've got your challenge. They say that there's causal and epistemological issues with numbers existing. If numbers exist, they say, they're up in they're abstract objects outside space and time. They're in Platonic heaven. And if they're outside space and time, well, they don't causally interact with us. They don't send out like magic rays that make Nikk Effingham know about the number 2. And if they don't send out magic rays to let me know about them, how do I know about them? So there's this epistemological barrier. Like, how do I come to know about these things that I've got no causal interaction with? Similarly, should you believe anything exists if it's not causally efficacious? Can anything exist if it's not causally efficacious? So they're the two sides. So you've got the people who are going to say that numbers don't exist. But if numbers don't exist, then why are my statements about numbers true? What makes it true that 2 + 4 = 6? Like, like mathematicians ask very complicated questions about numbers. What's going on if they're not asking questions about numbers? If they don't exist, if the numbers aren't there, and many philosophers believe the numbers aren't there, and they obviously every philosopher believes the mathematicians are doing something sensible. Like, as soon as you turn around and think mathematicians are talking garbage, and everything they say is false because numbers don't exist, as soon as you say something like that, you're done. We're not. That theory has too many costs. Like, if your metaphysical theory involves me knocking on the door of my mathematician mates and going, we should fire you, you're useless. Well, that's a cost. That's a cost. No one can ever believe it. So even those people who believe that there's no numbers, they're going to have to now tell me the probably quite complicated theory about what is going on. What is going on with mathematicians if there's no numbers? And that's the challenge. Like, pick your team. You're a realist or you're a nominalist.
And I think in metaphysics and ontology, usually the answer from people that are not yet confronted with this question is, it's just a concept. We just come up with this. That's a concept. We thought, okay, maybe 2, 3, 4, and then we learn those things, and it just happens to, through evolution, we kind of made sense, and now we have this tool that we're using. What would be the counter? What's the challenge with this?
So one of the ways I tackle this kind of response is to take it very literally and say, well, look, the thing we're talking about, the number or holes or whatever, they aren't literally concepts. They aren't literally concepts. There's a difference between a thing and the concept of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you agree that you've got a concept of a thing, you shouldn't mistake that for believing that the thing exists. So if I'm dying of dehydration in the desert, what I really want is a glass of water. And if I'm with you and you go, well, I've got a concept of a glass of water, will that help? I'll be like, your concept of a glass of water is of no help. I needed a glass of water. So when we're discussing whether numbers exist, and someone says, well, I've got the concept of a number, they tend to then ally that with saying, well, numbers do exist. They're just concepts. And I'm like, no, that's not true. The thing is not the concept of the thing. What they might want to do is to say that they can deliver an anti-realist theory. So the thing doesn't exist, and you don't need the thing to exist because you'll do all of the theoretical work with the concept of the thing. And that will have some legs, but then we'll go, then I'll turn around and go, so, why does 2 + 3 = 5? And someone might then start saying, well, it's intrinsic to the concept of 2 and intrinsic to the concept of 3 that they add up to 5. And I'll be like, well, why is it intrinsic to the concept of 2? There's an infinite number of numbers. I can do this a lot. And their explanation will then sound worryingly brute. They'll have to have like an infinite number of brute facts one fairly number, saying, well, it's intrinsic to the number 78 million, that if you take one off it, you're left with 77,999,999. I'm like, well, that can be your theory, your brutalist theory. Could I interest you in some other better theory? Maybe it's a theory that believes in numbers. That would make it simpler. Maybe it's a theory that doesn't believe in numbers, but has a much better explanation of what it is that the mathematicians are doing when they're doing mathematics and asking complicated questions. That is perhaps a spiritual successor, but certainly significantly better than the theory we've just discussed here, where someone goes, oh, I think it's all concepts. Like, maybe you're onto something when you say, I think it's all concepts, but you're only onto something in the same way that someone says, I think the sun makes things hot, somehow leads us to building better nuclear reactors. There's a lot of theoretical load between those two things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe it's all to do with concepts. Yeah, that's not a bad insight. The actual theory that the metaphysicians are going to develop that explains, without using numbers, what the mathematicians are doing, it's significantly more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'd say. Again, usually my maneuver is just whatever anyone says for me to go, you'll find that there's metaphysicians who believe that, and working the details out is itself an academic enterprise.
As an answer to say, well, it's a brute fact that we have those concepts, and that's just what numbers as a concept do. Why could it be an answer just as in the same way we said the blackness of my shirt is just a concept and that's it? Like, there's nothing to explain. Is there a difference between the numbers example and the properties?
Well, I mean, I think there is a bit of there's a weirdness. Just saying that the bruteness of your shirt is somehow part of the concept of your shirt and my shirt, that sounds weird, because like that just seems to be not true. Like, I think your t-shirt's black. I've never seen your t-shirt till today. I acquired the concept of your t-shirt during this interview. It seems a bit weird to think that the blackness of it is somehow an inexplicable part of the concept of that t-shirt. That seems to be just false. So you could say it, but I wouldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that concepts might play a role with properties, some people have said that. They're like, well, we have a concept of blackness, and it's enough that your t-shirt falls under that concept and Nick's t-shirt falls under that concept for them to be the same thing. That is a theory. I think it's a bad theory, because I think it doesn't genuinely explain the resemblances. So imagine you meet somebody who has the concept of being either black or blue. They've developed in their mind the concept. Call it schmergen. I go, a schmergen? What's a schmergen? And they go, you're schmergen. Actually, make it not black or blue. You're schmergen if you're a black t-shirt or a member of the UK Parliament. So they've explained the concept to me, and I now know the schmergen. This isn't a schmergen. This is a schmergen. Keir Starmer's a schmergen. Like, Donald Trump isn't a schmergen. So I can use this concept brilliantly. Is it the case that my t-shirt and Keir Starmer genuinely resemble just because they are both schmergen? No. That's not really a genuine resemblance. So this theory of just falling under concepts, it sounds like it's got to be supplemented by something that captures the idea that there's an underlying structure to the universe of things that genuinely resemble versus things that don't.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Flag up the warning. There's a bunch of people who are like, there's no such thing as genuine resemblance. There's only the resemblances we import in the world, and now we're back to doing metaphysics. You know, go and ask a physicist: is it the case that this electron and this electron genuinely resemble in a way that this electron does not resemble this proton? If they say yes, it sounds like they're with me. If they say resemblance is a made-up notion, then it sounds like they're on the other side. Who's right, who's wrong? Sounds like we're going to do a load of metaphysics to find that out. That metaphysics will inform our ontology. We're back to doing ontology.
Yeah, and I think for everyone that listens to this exchange and believes that we reach in the end conclusions that are very weird. And it's like, usually philosophers, it's a bit like, oh, you're so disconnected to the world. How come do you believe that, if you're Plato, there is this realm, this heaven where there is numbers and justice and whatever, the perfect form of a horse. And we have David Lewis that has these plural words and these kind of things. I really like what Russell says when in his theories of description, he knows that he's trying to explain how do words refer to objects. And he has a very complex, or like some kind of complex theory that is, when you listen to that the first time, it's really like, why do you go there? And he just says, well, try do it yourself, like try to really explain it. And I feel that usually that's open up, the answer from people is like, there's nothing to explain. It's a brute fact. But as we said, like, it's kind of like dodging the bullet. Like you just say, well, like, why is there life? There just is. It's uninformative. And so I think this is where, like, in metaphysics and philosophy in general, if you start to take those questions seriously, there is a lot that you can explore there and try to bring better explanations.
Yeah.
Is that convincing? Do you agree with me? Or does the picture change later when you're at a certain level?
I mean, I think it's good to continually circle back to the basic debates you start off with, because you will then start to lose touch with the common person in a way that you're worried about in the first initial. I think it is true, however, that when someone advances these metaphysical theories, they'll insist that they only sound weird if you phrase them in a certain way. So we've had one example already. David Lewis believes in talking donkeys. Sounds less weird when you realize he doesn't believe that they actually exist. Believing in numbers. If I turn around and say to a physicist, I believe that there's lots of things outside space and time, and I know about them, that sounds kind of weird to the physicist. Sounds less weird when they find out that I meant numbers. I happen to believe that there can be two objects in the same place at the same time. Sounds weird. Sounds less weird when you discover that I meant my body and me. That we are in two different things in the same place at the same time. So a lot of it actually is that the theories, when you say, I'm worried that these theories say these weird counterintuitive things, any theory worth its salt is going to be trying to convince you that it's just not that weird, that it's not saying anything counterintuitive. And that goes all the way back to the start when I said, why would you be interested in ontological theory? Well, any ontological theory you finally settle on probably won't be that radically the visionary. It won't revise that many beliefs. Why won't it revise any beliefs? Because if I made you believe it, it must have been in line with the data. Your beliefs are part of that data. It can't revise too many beliefs. So, yeah, hitting a few different bases there at the same time.
I will put in the description the information. You have a website where you have a lot of information. I think most of your work is for free there.
Yeah, most of the work, some of the early stuff isn't for free, but most of it is.
Yeah, and there is, I read the Introduction to Ontology that I found really accessible and fascinating, so I really recommend this one. Do you have anything else that you're working on that you want to plug?
Oh, that's a left field question. What am I working on at the moment? I'm working on a theory of time, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend the average reader to listen to get stuck into that. If you're interested in an interesting piece of metaphysics, I would recommend the dialogue called Celebrities Discuss Philosophy on my website. That's freely available. And that's a fun evening in sitting down and doing a bit of metaphysics and see what you think of that. So if you really are skeptical or interested in doing some metaphysics, that'd work out quite nicely.
Professor Effingham, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been brilliant.